is another Real Talk with Geoffrey, and I appreciate that and I don't want to be too flattering, but you're one of my favorite professors as a youth, and was very appreciative of the times that you actually were hard on me, because I needed it, as well as, I've spoken to many of my classmates since, and your name is brought up very fondly with many, even though you were also tough on them. Although this is, a short amount of time, we'll continue this. And I hope that anybody that does spend time watching this video that's about to come up, that you reach out and give me your thoughts, because I think that's very important. Don't just listen, interact with me with this. And with that, here's the video. There is now there are boxes that if you check them, you are the other.
Yes.
And the thing is, we're not the other at all, because the vast majority of people are thinking and feeling this way. But what they're not doing is seeing others that are reinforcing what they're already feeling.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
I agree with you, and I also think that there is a very vocal minority that likes to pitbull everybody else,
100%.
To attack them.
For sure.
And so I think there are a lot of people that think, I don't want that. I don't want to be attacked. I don't want to have the nuisance of it or the pain of it.
No.
And then there's a fear of losing your job or your position or what have you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that seems to be rather ubiquitous, and it's been that way for, I think, about 3 or 4 years.
It's been there for 3 to 4 years. Mm-hmm. So it got to the point where during the pandemic, I would actually reach out to people and invite them. No, actually, let me backtrack that. I was pretty vocal with what I would add on Facebook, because nobody could, everybody knew what I was thinking, because I'm just not worried about the social blowback. And I don't know why that is. Maybe it's because I enjoy rabble-rousing, potentially. But, if that's the case, then that's the case. But people would text me, or they'd shoot me a message on Facebook and say things like, Geoffrey, I really think the same. And I said, well, guess what? So many other people do.
Yes.
So let's go have lunch. And one of the persons that reached out to me was one of the Warrens, one of the older Warrens. And
yes. The family.
Yeah. And I said, let's go have lunch. And for a while, we basically were just discussing, hey, there's a lot of us. A lot of us are thinking and feeling this right now.
Yeah.
And he's like, I just didn't realize. And I was like, start asking people to go get a bite to eat and ask them how are they feeling. Because this culture of fear and our inability to say what's on our mind is actually the most anti-American,
totally agree.
Cultural newness that all of us are dealing with.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
Yes, I totally agree on that. And if one believes in spiritual powers, one could say this is the way that the spiritual powers, the negative spiritual powers, demonic and all, operate, because they want to isolate and separate.
For sure.
And that's, you don't even have to talk about demonic powers. You could talk about military powers.
Yeah.
Military, the way that you defeat the enemy is you isolate, you separate and isolate, and
divide and conquer.
Divide and conquer.
Yeah.
No, it's been really interesting for me to reflect back on the last, I would say 4 years, because probably 2019, to reflect back on the last 4 years and what has gone on, because I remember a similar social cataclysm occurring in 2001, when we got attacked at 911. And there was this sudden wake-up call to what are we doing? What are we about? What's going on? And this sense that something is different than it was in the 90s, for instance. And the same thing seems to be happening now. Something's really different than it was in 2018. And I think a lot of it is this fear factor, if you will.
One of the things that I heard another person say, which I thought was interesting, was, why do you notice so many more people with tattoos? It's not because the tattoos have become, and I'm not anti-tattoo.
Right.
Sometimes I think if there's a babe that's got some tattoos, I'm like, holy smokes. But it's, why are so many more people willing to have them?
Right.
And he said something that I thought was very interesting. So few people are willing to say what's on their mind, to differentiate themselves, that they do so with imagery on their skin because they're just no longer able to be themselves anymore, because so many are captured by the sameness edict that we're all like kind of like being told to be. Like, you must think and feel the same with everybody now. And so you throw some earrings in your face and some tattoos on your skin so that you don't have to feel that sameness, but you're not actually projecting who you are. You're just kind of like, that's just an accessory, an article of clothing. And I haven't been able to kind of shake that thought ever since I was like thought that. But it's, I think it's just very trying times.
Yes, it is.
You
Yes,
know.
it is.
Yeah.
Well, you and I go way back.
Way back.
Yeah.
20 years ago.
20 years ago.
That's a long time.
It was 20 years ago today. Yeah, 20 years ago. And you recall, if you will, that Trinity, right, used to come down all the time about the uniform, keep the uniform straight. And one of the things that I was trying to put across to students at the time, and I still hold this, is that the expression of yourself should be through your mind and your thoughts and what you say and what you do. It shouldn't have to be through your physical appearance. So that a man who is, who is not Shaquille O'Neal, for instance, might be able to gain the same level of honor doing his thing than what Shaquille O'Neal can do, or he might be able to express himself well enough that he holds his own against people that are in politics or people that are in high levels of power. I think that, to your point, I think there are a lot of folks now that they no longer believe that that's the case. I think they no longer believe that they can express their ideas or their opinions orally. And so it may be that there's a lot of rebellion against that and wanting to express yourself visually. May account for the whole pink hair phenomenon too, which I find
so much more than it
remarkable.
used to be.
Yes, yes.
And I think taking that a step further is people may simply be unable to describe what they're holding within their mind because they're not intellectually trained to have the capacity to verbalize it anymore either.
Yes.
Which I think is, I'm also kind of like nervous about that because it just seems like, and I shouldn't say this because it sounds judgmental beyond belief, but people seem dumber. And somebody's gonna reach out and say, God, Geoffrey, that's kind of a shitty thing to say, and it might be, but it seems like I was in a sauna a couple days ago, and I enjoy a sauna.
Right.
But I was through the door overhearing a teacher that was in a whirlpool, and he was complaining at a very high level about how his kids are dumb. And I was like, dude, read the room, right? If they're dumb, it's because you're not helping them achieve some kind of like capacity here.
Yes.
And it was just complaint after complaint, and I get it, it's a challenging job. I'll never really understand it. I can't believe that you were my professor at one point. I was a crazy kid. I'm sure you have tons of crazy kids.
I have a lot of crazy kids.
So like complaining is natural,
Yeah.
right? But only complaining and kind of like reducing them as such, I felt like you shouldn't be doing this.
Yeah, interesting.
You know, and I think there's a lot of teachers and professors, and this is not where I don't necessarily want to bring this conversation to this, but I think there's a lot of people that just have the job because they're protected to, instead of it being a calling.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I have struggled with this in the last few years because I've been through a few things that have jaded me a great deal. I'm not the man you used to know.
Well, I'd like to hear.
But I have been jaded about a number of things. But I have come back to this sense of vocation in teaching. And that might be a very nice segue into talking about that issue. I think that if you go into teaching, you have to have a sense of vocation.
I think so.
I don't think there's a way to go into it with the idea you're going to make a lot of money is absolute foolishness. I mean, it's not going to happen. To think that you're going to have popularity and fame, be some Indiana Jones, is just also the height of foolishness. Really, I think the only way that you're going to go into the profession is with the sense that somehow there's a vocational level to it. And by vocational, I mean that you are, as C.S. Lewis says, you're handing on the tradition of your forefathers to this next generation. You're old birds teaching young birds how to fly. What that means to some degree is that you're training them how to think, and you're exposing them to great works like Thucydides and Dante and things like that, you know, and they have to come up against that wall of, I've never met this before. Can I actually make it over this and understand it? But you do so with a certain level of love and compassion and trying to bring them along with all of their idiocy, because they're young kids and that's synonymous with idiot.
And the hormones.
Yeah, and the hormones, right? And all that other stuff. And you have to bring them along with a certain level of compassion. And there has been a time-honored way to do that. I mean, for generations, there's been a method for doing that. I bristle at the idea, and I've always bristled at the idea that kids are stupider today. That's like, you know, things were great in my day, but now they just stink. Well, they weren't great in your day. You know, you had the same problems then. The difference, this is where I get really cynical. The difference is I think that there has been an intentional, a categorical destruction of the methodology to be able to train people, to be able to train not just young people, but older people as well. Everything from the grade schools up to the colleges has had a breakdown or collapse of the method by which we used to train people in all this. And that's where I find it's really disturbing to me, because humans are humans from generation to generation. But when we talk about things like civilization versus barbarism, I think barbarism is a response to the cruelty and the terror of life without any means, no structured means to respond to it.
The strong man arises in chaos.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
And the strong man may not actually be a person of character. It might just be a barbaric person that can wield force.
Well, to that end, I forget the guy's name, and maybe I shouldn't drop his name, but there's this YouTube phenomenon that I'm dealing with right now, which is that the kids I teach, the age that I teach, 7th to 8th grade, right around there. What is his name? It's Andrew something or another, but he has a YouTube phenomenon.
Tate.
That's the guy, Andrew Tate. And they're all enamored of him. And he's, for anybody who doesn't know him, he's this machismo guy, and he smokes cigars and talks big, and he's rather misogynistic, and he represents all this sort of like wealth and the kids that look at him look at this machismo man and they think that's what I want to be, because they don't have any alternative.
Correct.
And that's shocking to me. That's the strongman theory that you just threw out, without any kind of structured training in how to be an autonomous individual. I think humans naturally gravitate towards a barbaric leader who's going to be the guy who kind of leads them out of their own awfulness. But that, to me, it's appalling, and that's why I rediscovered.
Because his past is quite disgusting. It's quite repulsive.
Yeah,
the things that he had done.
Exactly.
Yeah.
From what I've read of him, he's not the paragon that anybody should follow. But there are a great number of characters out there like that people gravitate towards. The gang thing, for instance, in inner cities is a similar business. You know, kids gravitate towards that because they see that power or that violence or that strength is going to be the savior of their world. I think it's falling into a level of barbarism, which is really sad to see.
It seems to be happening at an exponentially quicker rate.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Now, that I agree with. Stupider, I don't agree with at all.
Yeah.
I don't agree with. And I think that they're very clever and very potentially intelligent young people who fall into that barbarism and that clannishness.
Sure.
Yeah. You know, Marshall McLuhan, way back in the day, he was I don't know if I introduced you guys to Marshall McLuhan. Great writer, Canadian, Catholic. But he was a Canadian writer, and he wrote about technology back in the day. His famous book is called The Mechanical Bride, and he says in The Mechanical Bride that modern advertising is going to take over society, and that modern advertising basically they don't want autonomous individuals. They want to keep everybody, as he says, this is his phrase, in a perpetual state of mental rutting. Rutting, which is an old English word for having sex.
Okay.
But it's like a perpetual state of mental rutting, not physical, which I find really interesting. If it were a perpetual state of physical rutting, it might be a totally different story. But mental rutting is where you're always longing for the thing and thinking you're going to get the thing and going for the thing in your mind, but never actually encountering the real thing.
Constant state of dissatisfaction.
Yes, yeah, constant state of dissatisfaction. And a state where you never have the actual, I don't know what it is, the thumos, the Greeks would say. You never have the thumos, the courage, to be able to go out and ask a real girl on a date, for instance. Instead, you're always looking for that perfect girl, that internet girl, that girl on the screen, whatever it is.
Exist.
It doesn't exist.
No.
Yeah. But McLuhan makes the point that it strips a person of being able to encounter actual reality, this fantasy world. And he said that in our increasing electronic world, which at the time was mostly TV for him, he says the number of things that are going to happen, and one of the things that's going to happen is that we're going to fall into clannishness. And at the time when I read that, I didn't understand what he meant, falling into clannishness.
See, what's interesting is I see people, and it's not recent, I've seen this change over the last 4 or 5 years, where they will choose a group that they believe reinforces their own and everybody else is the other, instead of being willing to hear another out. It's like a rush to attack. And again, it just seems like the America that I am seeing now, and I don't want to be a non-optimist because I fall into that trap. I think we all can fall into negative traps from time to time. But this is a different America than in the 90s or in the 2000s. Not because I'm more self-aware and I can see more in the modern era. It just is a different place. And, I have resentment of that in some capacity. And I don't know how else to kind of like get out of this negative feedback loop other than, and this is another reason why I do this, have conversations with people that I admire and respect, and then realize, oh, there's a lot of us. There's a lot of people like us.
There are a great many.
And, I worry about this silent majority statement, because I think the silent majority is a term that almost encourages people to just be quiet when they're actually similar with a lot of others. And so, again, you asked, why are you doing this? And I'm doing this, and I'd like to do more of these with all different kinds of people. It's fun that my professor is here, but my own professor, I should say. But it's like there's neighborhoods of us, essentially. And I don't mean us as in like this group, but of people that believe in goodness.
Yes. Yeah.
And they're just unwilling to say it any longer. And I think this goes off, what's this gentleman's name that you said, this Canadian author?
Marshall McLuhan.
I think he's right. It's like the advertisement is trying its absolute hardest to keep us in a state of having the inability to enjoy what we have,
yes,
and instead enjoy each other.
Yeah,
and that's
because you get more interested in things than people.
Yeah,
and the acquisition of the Lamborghini and the acquisition of the new thing, the iPhone, whatever.
Sure.
And you lose the connection to human beings.
Yeah.
I personally think that what you're doing here is one of the things I would advocate as exactly the solution to this. There has to be more human connection.
There has to be more human connection.
There has to be more human connection. There has to be more human community.
Do you want one?
Oh, no, thank you.
All
I'm
right.
admiring
If you're thirsty, just there's water and everything.
I appreciate it. There has to be more human community. There has to be more human interaction. I also think that there has to be a lot more mercy. And that's something which really grieves me. And I see it on both sides of the political fence. Mercy is something that's been lost in this whole deluge that's occurred, this tsunami that we've experienced in the last 3 years. And what I mean by that is that most In my experience, most conversations assume mercy with the other person. That is, you're a human going through human things and dealing with human things. I'm also a human going through human things. I can't expect you to have all the answers, nor can I expect you to be just the enemy. No. I have to approach a conversation with you, even if I disagree with you politically or whatever, with the idea that, look, you're going to be facing cancer or diabetes or poverty or whatever it is at some point in your life. You're already dealing with whatever it is, that you're dealing with. Mercy would dictate that then I would say, okay, we may disagree, but at the end of the day, we both of us like a beer, we both of us like a steak, we both of us are facing mortality at some point. I can't think that somehow just because we disagree politically, you're some kind of Grendel that I have to slay with a sword.
Sure.
And I think that's what I came to the conclusion.
But
that's what McLuhan means by clannishness. Clannishness it does several things, but one of the things it does is it automatically separates us and them, as you said. And the them needs to be exterminated in this mindset.
Sure.
And it's very, very deadly because we look back in history and we say, hey, that's been tried. And it's not pretty.
It's not pretty. And we're seeing it.
Yeah, I know.
But where is there have you heard the term psychopathic empathy?
Yeah.
All right, so where does the need for mercy, because I agree, I think this is something that we need to have. We need to empathize with others, but when does it become a lack of standard for another, right? Where it seems like people are willing to look past some pretty repulsive acts if they're a part of them. So like how do you balance that in a proper functioning? And I think in terms of, because I'm a real estate guy, I think in terms of neighborhoods, how do you keep making sure that your neighbor is a good person and at the same time realize that they're also going through their own battles, And I don't know how to do that yet.
Yeah, that's a question that it's a multifaceted answer. There's no silver bullet answer for that. I'm reminded immediately of the Robert Frost poem of "Good walls make good neighbors."
Sure.
One thing I think is that this is my side of the wall, that's your side of the wall, and there's no reason to necessarily go over that wall either way.
There's no reason to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of standards, my daughter and I were watching this series from Chris Rock called "Everybody Hates Chris." That's very funny.
Is this a 90s?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's very funny. I've never seen it before. It's very funny. And in one of the episodes, the father lends out the room upstairs to this guy. He's a very soft-spoken guy, but it turns out he's a mass murderer or something.
Was it a bit, or was this like a thing that actually happened?
I don't know. This is a semi-autobiographical.
All right.
It's something that happened to Chris Rock when he was a kid. But it's kind of funny because it's like, yeah, you let the guy have the room upstairs, but at some point, that guy's got to go.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's a very good question. I often wonder whether or not whether it can be answered outside of a religious context.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is when we think of a religious context, the major religions primarily of Christianity, but also Judaism and to some degree of Buddhism, all those religions advocate a concern for the good of the other. What's best for humans as humans and what's best for this individual human. And if we envision that or we desire that for the other person, then anything we say, well, this is wrong or you can't do that, I think is always in the context of what's best for that person. Not a draconian, you follow these laws or we chop your hands off, you follow these laws or we throw you in the pokey or whatever it is, because that's ridiculous. That's fascism. It's got to be answered, I think, to the degree of these things you're doing are detrimental to you and everybody else. These things that you're doing are destroying all the good. These things that you're doing are going to eventually hurt you tremendously. So
how can you respond to that with no physical response? Always. like what we're seeing in San Fran or California, where there's these people that are shooting up on the sidewalk, why shouldn't it be how it would be handled in Singapore, where they would just cane the guy because you've gone too far?
Yeah.
I mean, is there no value in inflicting a little bit of, I don't want to say suffering, because it does sound terrible.
Yeah, it does.
You know?
Yeah. It does sound terrible, especially to our mollycoddling nature in America, because
Yeah.
there's a big mollycoddling thing.
The parents aren't willing to spank their kids anymore,
no.
and they recall their great-grandparents that did nothing but slap their kids around,
Oh, yeah.
right? So again, where's that balance where a little bit of, having a standard versus having psychopathic empathy,
Yeah,
or an
right.
overabundance of empathy or mercy or whatever it is? Like, where's the right, a little bit of each with each situation? I don't know. It's
I don't have an absolute answer.
Yeah.
I know that when our system, and we're getting into a whole legal thing here, and a whole the penal system in America, I think that we've had a serious breakdown in both our legal system and our penal system, where on the one hand, those who transgress law are not punished for it financially or time-wise or anything else. Or they're punished to such a degree it's like a slap on the wrist and then released. And I know this is a problem, as you mentioned, in places like San Francisco and in New York.
Or we can say Minneapolis.
Or even Minneapolis, to bring it
Minnesota
close
at
to
large.
home.
Yeah.
Where the people who have fallen into criminal behavior know that they can get away with it. There was this thing that happened, I think it was in San Francisco, where the guys walked in and basically were stealing from, this 7-Eleven or whatever. And the owner came out and he just beat the guy up with a baseball bat or something to stop him from
The
doing
Sikh
it.
guy, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because, at that point, what do you do? The people come in, they steal, and there's no repercussions, and they know they're not going to get punished at all. I think as the state begins to fall down on the job, individuals feel inclined to take matters into their own hands. But again, this is
the revert to barbarism.
This is the revert to barbarism, right? Barbarism is where you as an individual have to shoot other people with a shotgun when they come onto your property.
Sure.
I got a shotgun, you ain't got one, that kind of thing.
Sure.
It's civilization where the state functions well, judges crime as crime, and gives an appropriate penalty for it.
Yeah.
And when you have a breakdown, like I think we're seeing, that's a huge portion of this, when you have a breakdown in the civil system, then you also see not just a rise in crime, but you see a rise in this barbaric attempting to save yourself, save your own stuff. I find it really awful. And it's why I get very disturbed by anybody that says everything's okay, everything's fine, it's just going swimmingly. Because it's not.
No.
It's not.
No.
Now, I don't have a solution for it, and thank God I'm not in a position where I have to decide that. I just have to teach 7th and 8th graders.
Yeah.
But when you do have that situation going on, there's this urge to want to say, I have a solution, and you better listen to me, and get out of my way if you disagree. And that's also, I think, a trap. Which is why I go back to this, I go back to mercy again. Maybe this issue is something which I don't have a solution for, and maybe it's something I shouldn't wade in and start talking up a storm when I don't really have the way to fix it necessarily.
How do you, 7th and 8th graders are wild humans.
Yes, they are.
How, and I'm sure at Providence they act out like every 7th and 8th grader would at every school. It doesn't matter, homeschooled, public, whatever. How are you doing it differently now than you did?
Oh, absolutely.
How are you handling it now?
Well, I shouldn't say absolutely. I mean, yes and no.
Yeah.
I'm not doing it differently in the sense that I've given up on the idea that people can be great.
Yeah.
Because I've always held this idea that humans amaze me, capable of greatness and wonders. And not giving up on the idea of high ideals or high standards, because I still have those. But one thing that has happened in the last 20 years is a real tempering of a great deal more understanding of the stupidity of young people, especially, but humans in general. There's a saying of never ascribe to malice what can be attributed to stupidity and incompetence. And I forget who that is, probably Marcus Aurelius or something like that. But for me now, when I'm working with young 7th and 8th graders, I find that I do hold them to standards. And I say, these are the standards you have to meet. But on the other hand, I'm like, there's a goof-off level, and there's a silliness level, and a squirreliness level, which that's part of growing up. Young men especially. I think
because it's fun to act out.
It is. Yeah. It is. Yeah. And it's also part of the tempering of the tribe.
Sure.
As men,
setting dominance in the classroom.
Yes.
How far can I push the button?
Right.
With no consequence or recourse.
And as a man, where do I fit in the whole world of men?
Sure.
Other young men are going to test me. Older men are going to test me. How far do I push against another man before something happens? I was reminded the other day. We had a neighbor, and we got along very well with them, but we did have a couple falling outs when I was a young guy. And there was one point where I got really mad at the guy, and I came up to him and I pushed him. I was like really angry. Well, he was bigger and stronger than I was, and I didn't account for this. So he pushed me, and it really hurt. Yeah. And I was like, wait a minute. I had to check myself. I said, wait a minute. There's a consequence. If I'm going to be physical with this guy, it's going to be physical back.
Yeah.
And I really think that's part of growing up as a young man. Especially, you have to understand that your physicality is going to have limits. And you can do certain things, but there's certain things you really shouldn't do or can't say. I really find that my work with young men especially has been interesting in this realm, because that hasn't changed hardly at all in the 20 years I've been working, 26 years I've been teaching. Young guys are still young guys. They're just as silly and stupid and amazing and wonderful as they always were, as your class was.
Yeah.
And now that I look back and I look at the guys that I have taught, and they've gone on to do things, tank commanders in the army or whatever, or guys that own their own business or whatever it is. And I think, wow, did you ever think that you would be in this position when you were this idiot, dumbass 7th grader back in the day?
Sure.
But I also think for the teaching of young kids, I can't ever forget that I too was a young kid at one point. And this goes back to the question of mercy. I had so many good teachers.
Yeah.
Joe Stanty, God rest him, and Bill Walker, for instance, and Dennis Staffelbach, and my own father, God rest his soul. And
Bill Walker being Trinity's Bill Walker?
Yes.
He was a teacher of yours?
Yes, he was, yeah.
When was that? How old were you?
Oh, gosh, that was back in the 80s.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Well, I went to the 84 to 88. I was at Trinity there in Greenlawn.
Sure.
And Bill Walker was a teacher of religion at the time.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
You were a student of Trinity.
I was. Graduated in 88.
Got it.
That's
Okay.
right. And a funny story of how I got to the Trinity here, in Minneapolis. But one way or the other, I wound up working for Bill Walker. And he had trained me as a young guy. And then as an older guy, when I was still cutting my teeth, because I was only like 4 years into the business when I started at Trinity. It was my 5th year of teaching. And I still had this sort of self-righteousness that I wanted to make sure kids knew that God hated them if they failed a quiz.
That's what we felt.
Yeah, right? The wrath of Jesus.
Yes. Yeah.
And I remember one time I actually wrote something like that on a quiz. And my intention was to attach shame to the failure academic. And I remember Bill Walker bringing me into his office and saying, do you not think that this young guy is going through something painful right now? Do you really think that you're shaming him is going to help his academics in any way? And I had never thought about it that way. And I was like,
kind of a click.
Yeah, you're right. My job is not to shame kids. My job is not to put the fear of God into them necessarily. My job is to try and get them to the point where they are capable of doing this work, which is tough work to do. And it takes a lot of sweat and tears to do it. But not to necessarily attach the wrath of God to a test or quiz.
Is there any usefulness to shame just in general?
Oh, I think so.
Yeah.
I do think so. But what is the difference that they make? The distinction is between a shame culture and an honor culture, I think, is the difference.
Well, what is Japan? Are they a shame culture or are they an honor culture?
They're an honor.
They work harder, the hardest.
Yeah.
They take, if they are, if their superior were to demean them, they would be ashamed for a long period of time.
Yes,
and they really internalize it. At least that's one of my friends had taught me.
Yeah, and I may be getting the distinction wrong, but the distinction is primarily between outward shame and especially public shame, and feeling that is one, and then the other is the feeling like you have screwed up, feeling like you have done something that is less than your best work, that you have sinned, basically. Maybe it's a difference. Maybe it's a shame and guilt culture. Maybe that's the distinction.
Sure.
And the shame culture ends up having all appearances. You know, you keep the appearance of honor, but inside you're no good. You know, and inside you really are cutting corners constantly. Guilt culture, if I get it right, is one where you're like, I really want to do the best, and I want to hold myself to a standard, and I want to be able to do what's right by other people. And when you screw up, you feel this sense like, gosh, I really dropped the ball on that one. Even if nobody finds out, you know, even if nobody knows. And so in our culture, is there an element or a place for shame? I think there is, because I think that it's the guilt that one feels is something that kind of gets trained, it gets grown in you. Like, I never wanted to let my dad down. You know, I never wanted Dad to think that I was.
With us, or
no, he passed on several years ago. But I never wanted him to think that I was screwing up. So I screwed up a lot, Geoffrey. I mean, boy, we don't need to go into that necessarily. But when I did, I always felt, gosh, that was bad, because I didn't want people to think less of me. And I didn't want especially people that I honored and respected to think less of me. And so I tried to improve. I tried to make myself better. I didn't just try to cut corners and get away with things. And I think that in that sense, shame can be a very positive thing in society, because I think that it is the opinion of other people that kind of motivates you to fix things. Yes. Yeah. Yes, I think so. It's when we start thinking of it as long as I don't get shamed, I can get away with things. That's where it's bad. Or the gaining of honor through even doing awful things. You know, you gain honor through being audacious and going out and doing something really brazen, like breaking the law. And to that end, I think that we have a big problem right now, as I mentioned the Andrew Tate phenomenon. I think we have a big problem right now with young people thinking that if they don't get caught with something, it's okay, as long as they're gaining honor and not being shamed publicly.
Sure.
And it's been exacerbated, I think, by online technology, you know, especially games, video games. Now, I don't know if you recall, but I'm a fan of video games to a great degree.
I didn't know this.
Okay.
Like Morrowind or what? Like Morrowind? Are we talking about like Elder Scroll? Or?
Yeah. I played Elder Scrolls. You know.
Are you a Call of Duty guy?
I did play Call of Duty until it turned rotten.
No idea.
BioShock, Fallout 4. Yeah, I played a great number of video
With the headset and everything?
Nah, not that extreme, no. No, I never got a kit because I was embarrassed. I was like, now I'm really becoming like the video game dork, you know, and I didn't want to do that. But I'm a big advocate of that as a entertainment and as a way for young men especially to learn certain things about how to be a man. But I think there's a dark side to it, and this is why I have this kind of...
It's very insular.
Very insular, yeah. It's very insular. It prevents young men from going out and doing something in the world. Yeah. Because it's so easy. In a video game, you point and click. You know, in a video game, every object is there for what the game wants it to be.
There's no immediate social consequence for failing what's needed when reaching out to people. Yes. Which they might be disinterested.
Yep.
Yeah.
And what's more...
Which is why nobody's going on dates at an extreme young age anymore. Because they're just unwilling to fail if she says no.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's...
And besides, you could always go back to GTA and find another girl. You know?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. And I think that it's awful on the sense that it makes men more insular, and it doesn't grow the elements of thumos that allow you to be a real man when you grow up. And so you get these...
Thumos is Greek for...
Yeah, it's Greek for... It's the middle part of the body. In Plato, you know, you have the head and the chest and the loins. Yeah. And the loins are governed through the by the head through the chest.
Okay.
Thumos, a thumotic response, is manly response to any kind of danger or any kind of challenge.
Okay. Like being measured
Yeah.
in a state of extreme chaos or something.
Exactly. And the courage to be able to defend proximate goods, you know, property, women, self, things like that. And if that isn't developed, it atrophies. This is Lewis's whole point in Men Without Chests, where he talks about how modern society, and this is 1944 for goodness sakes, you know, modern society. He says modern society develops young men who are without chests. They don't have that thumotic response. It says basically modern society castrates men and then bids the geldings be fruitful.
In 44, he was saying.
Yeah.
This. Wow.
I mean, it's amazing. It was very prescient of him.
Yeah.
I encourage everybody to read this. Abolition of Man is a phenomenal work. It's really ahead of its time. And I think that response, that thumotic response, is absolutely vital to becoming a real man. And you talk about fear. I always think, well, I'm going to get in hot water for what I'm about to say, but screw it. I think a real man is somebody who has that kind of courageous thumotic response to life in general. It has nothing to do with how big your biceps are or how many cigars you smoke, you know, or whether you talk trash about other people. That's not manly behavior. You know, manly behavior can be in...
It's very superficial.
It's very superficial.
Yeah.
I think it was... it may have been Victor Davis Hanson who made this point. He says there are great men in history who were small or weak or even effeminate, who were tremendously thumotic, tremendously manly men. Thinking of people like George Patton. You know, George Patton, most people don't, they think of George C. Scott in the movie, right, coming out and saying, I want you guys to go through those guys like shit through a goose, you know. And he did actually say that. But he had a high voice, and he was very small. And
Patton had a high voice.
Patton had a high voice.
Nobody knows that.
No. So here's Patton.
Yeah.
He said, I don't want you people to go holding anything. I want you to go through them like shit through a goose. That's how he would have talked. And he was small, and he had very soft hands, apparently, strangely enough. I mean, this is like the biggest BA in World War II in the European theater.
Wow.
And he was a very slight, kind of, not scrawny, but just slight man. But that guy, gee whiz. Or you look at Julius Caesar. Caesar was the same way. You know, Caesar was very slight. He was all his life, he was kind of anemic.
I didn't know that.
But there's a famous story of Julius Caesar where he was captured by pirates as a young man. And they tied him to this post and they had left him outside, exposed, you know, he's an exposure for several days, while they were waiting for a ransom from his family, because he was one of these wealthy families. And Caesar says famously, he says, my family, you know, Latin, my family will pay the ransom. And then once I'm released, I will come back here and kill every one of you. And he did. Wow. You know, the son of a bitch did. He went back home after paying the rent and he hunted down these pirates and he slaughtered every one of them.
Wow.
You know, it was like, that's what's thinking, like, okay, violence.
So in that moment he had thumos.
Yeah, he had thumos,
Thumos, excuse me. Because he was capable of reasoning through that chaotic moment.
Yes, reasoning through it, holding himself together, and then having a response that wasn't like, oh, please, I don't want to die. But rather, I'm going to kill you bastards.
But that is not a glorified characteristic anymore.
No, it isn't.
Being measured is not respectable any longer, which is very strange. It's very strange. And I don't know, because it doesn't generate likes. It doesn't generate social standing any longer. And how do we... What is a great way of reverting back to it a little bit?
Well, before I answer that question, I would add it is attacked. It is not trained. It is shut down in schools. I mean, you drug young boys up so they don't cause trouble. You know, you put them in safe spaces. You encourage them to be sensitive, blah, 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 blah. You don't teach them any great works that are going to challenge them, so it's not trained at all. If a man does exercise the thing, then he's compared to this, you know, the Alan Tate type, barbarian type. And honestly, there's no reason to do it for young men, which I find really striking. And by that I mean, what reason does a young man nowadays have to search out a mate, to
build a family,
you know, to establish himself in a job, what reason does he have, or figures does he have to emulate at all? When you look at the movies, half the guys in the movies are idiots or wimpy or blubbering. It's like you don't see guys like Dirty Harry anymore. Not that he's the best, but do you feel lucky, punk? I mean, that's a powerful line. You don't see characters like Gregory Peck, in Big Country slugging it out with Charlton Heston. You don't. Movies are not made like The Longest Day or The Bridge Too Far. They're the movies that we have now, which are really that's our modern church movies.
For sure.
Because that's where people go to get the imagery of how they should live.
Yeah.
And most of our movies have characters that display an unmanly image.
And the flip side of that is the ones that do are the anti-hero.
Yeah.
And so they are cruel.
Yep.
And they're not protecting, self-serving, and kind of sadistic at times.
Yeah.
And so that is the figurehead that the young and me are kind of like being, entertained with.
Yeah, I find it really sad. I really do. I think that when you find a game like GTA, I'll pick on them for a minute.
Yeah.
Grand Theft Auto. When you find a game like that, as the paradigm for what a young man should be, we're in a very, very bad state if that's what it is. No longer do you have a man like Humphrey Bogart in Key Largo, for instance, who has the ability to smash his enemies, but holds back, restrains himself, and governs himself for the sake of everybody around him. You don't have that anymore, or at least it's very rare. It's very rare. There are some pieces of entertainment, video games and movies that do have that to a degree, but it's a very rare quality, and that's why I find a lot of young men, they don't gravitate towards that. They don't see any reason for it, and so they don't gravitate towards.
So what are they What are these 7th and 8th graders gravitating towards?
They're gravitating towards a coarseness and a violence and a silliness. They don't see a problem with talking trash or talking innuendo in front of women, for instance.
Wow.
But that's kind of startling.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you.
We didn't
agree.
do that at Trinity.
Never.
We were. Well, it was like there was no innuendo.
Yeah.
It was a quite sexless place. Let's just be honest. Yeah. It was very. I mean, if you were flirting, you were the othered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's not a good route either, necessarily.
No, it's too much.
But it's a question of, maybe it's a question of appropriateness. Prudence is one of the 4 cardinal virtues, and not prudery, prudence.
Sure.
The judgment of what's appropriate, and having things be in their place. That's a very necessary thing, not just for society, but for individuals as well. What to say when, what to do when to unleash the beast, I do still think that, because human nature doesn't really change, that all men have a beast in them, and it can be trained to become something very powerful and very dynamic. When it's untrained, it's worse than barbaric. It becomes something rather monstrous, Grendelian in the Beowulf story. There's a great passage out of, I think it's out of either Tacitus or out of Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, where he's talking about the barbarians, the Germans. And he says that in battle, they fight without any restraint. But when they go back to their camps, they are unrestrained in their indolence. They lounge about, let women do everything. They don't wash themselves, and it's like...
Living in the longhouse.
Yeah, it's like there's got to be a balance here somewhere. The beast of...
But they did win.
The barbarians?
Yeah. Well, I shouldn't say that they won. They kept them from expanding.
True.
Yeah.
They did, because after the Teutoburg Forest, that was bad news.
Yes.
Though I have a theory on that too. The Teutoburg Forest was a bad deal historically, absolutely, for Romans. But what I think ended up happening was that the Romans won ultimately, because the German people that came down into the area of Gaul and into the area of Cisalpine Gaul, they're on the other side of the Alps. They loved the Roman thing so much that they became Romans.
Sure.
And eventually Rome conquered them. They adopted
Roads were
all the
nice.
Roads were nice. Baths were nice.
Consistent food. It was
consistent
kind of
food.
Yeah.
So that many of these Germans began dressing and talking and acting and doing law and doing trade in a Roman way, because they recognized how good civilization was, especially probably compared to what they were living in, which was this unbridled barbarism. And eventually they went across the Channel and conquered England, and
Sure.
and so now we have that. But I think they recognized in Rome something that was really powerful and civilized and decent. I'm a big fan of a lot of the recent portrayals of Rome because it's so awesome to see the battles. But what I don't like about them is that they try to show Rome as equally barbaric to other peoples. And that's missing the point.
You mean when they're in the little groups and they're kind of sadistic people and yeah, okay.
Like the series Rome, for instance, recently.
That's what I was referring to.
It's a great series, but
Yeah.
it was great in some ways. In other ways, like you're showing me this sort of tawdry, awful thing that never ceased. And that would not be attractive to anybody, I think. And there was a really good movie called The Northman that came out too. I don't know if you saw that.
I've seen it 3 times. It's actually my favorite film.
Retelling of Hamlet, right? And a fantastic movie.
Very, very well done.
But it shows you what that barbaric life might have been like, and it's not pretty. No. It's really this you live and die by the sword. This is why Christianity, when it came to the Roman Empire, was such a beautiful thing, because people realized we don't have to live, even in civilization, we don't have to live by that sword anymore. Forgiveness rather than.
But is that what's happening?
So is that what's happening now in the long term? Yeah.
Because I look at Europe right now, and a lot of these newcomers coming into the European continent, you can't say that they're not acting barbaric. I mean, if you look at the streets of Italy or in France, one small thing can set off 500 people destroying the actual buildings.
Yeah.
And I get it, maybe I'm putting too much value on inanimate objects, but a week goes by and it looks like an absolute war has come through, and the trash. And
this is San Diego you're talking about?
Well, no, I'm just saying, but just in general.
I know.
In the same.
Yeah. I agree,
Yeah.
and it's horrendous. But here's the thing.
I don't know what the response is. I don't know.
Or is there one? Is there a response?
I don't know. It seems like no response is going to increase it.
Yeah, right.
Well,
okay.
I mean, the video of this person's boyfriend in Sweden where he comes up the ladder and then he jumps over the deck and then he pulls out a knife and he stabs and he throws a brick into the. I mean, having no response at all, that's going to increase.
Yes, it will. Of course.
So then, is there a need then to seek out the strong man? That's my question. Ultimately, I think.
Yeah.
Do we need to?
Yeah.
The fact that I'm even saying that is scary because we've seen what happens historically, time and time again, when people do put their faith in the strong man.
Right. Yeah. And what is it?
It's cataclysmic. Each time.
And our founding fathers even recognized that. I think Hamilton said something to the effect that the face of the tyrant most often hides behind the specious mask of an overt concern for the good of the people.
Yeah.
That you have somebody who rises to great power saying, I'm doing your good, doing good, ends up that guy is a dictator.
Yes.
And that's almost de rigueur for politics, in my opinion, because I think politics, it offers great power, absolute power to some degree. And we all know the phrase, that absolute power corrupts absolutely. Frank Herbert, the writer of Dune, had a famous saying where he says, it's not that power corrupts, but that it attracts to it people that are easily corruptible by power. I think it's a really good statement. But in terms of what you're asking, we're looking at an era, our current era, which is going through a definite transition, if nothing else, possibly cataclysm, possibly collapse. We won't know until 100 years.
It's going to be a change.
Definitely a change.
Nothing's really, nothing ever collapsed. It just changed drastically.
Yeah, it changed drastically, yes. And a knowledge of history is a very, very good thing because it gives to us perspective on how bad it could actually get.
Yeah.
Right before the COVID lockdowns, I watched Ken Burns' Dust Bowl series. And I had no intention of, I'm doing this for the lockdown. But I watched it right before the lockdowns, and the lockdowns occurred. I'm like, these are bad. But they're not Dust Bowl bad,
Sure.
And I think about things like the 1315 cold snap that led to the Little Ice Age, and the 1317 famine that occurred, and then the 1345 Black Death, and then the 100 Years' War, and that 14th century, which was a shit show for everybody in Europe. And to be honest, everybody in the Middle East and everybody in China too, because they were going through the same things. That was a really bad time to be alive. And it was a transitional time between the greatness of the 1200s and that warm period, what's called the classical warm period, and then the Renaissance of the 15th and 14th century. It was a transitional period. So at the time, were they saying that the world's coming to an end and it's collapsing and what do we do? Well, yeah, they did. You see it all over. In graffiti, people were like counting the days to the apocalypse. You see the drawings and paintings showing the four horsemen. You see people that writing about how whole villages were shut down by the plague and they just abandoned them or set them on fire and this was the end of the world. What's his name? Bruegel and Albrecht Dürer later drawing these pictures of these burning cities. It was a time where I think people were thinking the world was coming to an end. But our current era is definitely transitioning, and like I said, the old world is essentially gone. We are living in what we're living in now, and we have to deal with what we're dealing with now.
I just think it's silly when we call it the postmodern world.
Yeah.
Because it's like, in 100 years, what's the next term?
Is that the postmodern world? Yeah, right. But I think that this world, most people put the end of the old world as the dropping of the bomb there on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that's why this Oppenheimer movie is so bloody good and I think so appropriate.
Did you see it? I haven't seen it.
I've seen it twice. Okay. I highly recommend it. You have to have a strong constitution because it's not bloody or gory, but it's psychologically difficult because really Nolan goes into the psychology of a man like Oppenheimer. What kind of guy was that? And he's very much a man of the modern world. It's a powerful movie. But most people put the end of the old world at the dropping of the bomb, And certainly there's a lot to that. There was a whole series on the bomb, a podcast, which I highly recommend. It's, what's it called? I'm 53. That's why I forget stuff. It'll come to me when I don't need it. But it's something history, and Dan Carlin, yeah, that's his name, and it's Dan Carlin's history and of the atom bomb is absolutely phenomenal. And he says that's where this whole world that we had expected to happen collapsed after that bomb, was dropped. And I think
that was the true Great Reset.
I think it was
because people backed off.
Yeah, I think so.
From one another.
Yeah, I think so.
I was talking about that with a good friend of mine he had mentioned Japan when we were talking about what had just transpired with this knowledge of Elon not activating the information flow over Crimea recently that everybody's kind of like chattering about. Yeah. And I just said to him, well, if he's simply disinterested in encouraging death with information flow that he's already donating, like, do you feel? And his response was, well, the sinking of that fleet could have been an event like what we had done with Japan in making everybody back off from one another. And I was like, I just don't buy it. I think that the response to that would have been, and my mom lives in Europe, so I have this great fear that something pretty wild is going to happen as a response to that. But
pretty ubiquitous.
But his perspective is it would have been enough to calm it all down, and I don't know if I can buy that. They are a nuclear power now. Japan wasn't. They didn't have a response. They didn't have the capacity.
That's true.
They're not going to fly anything over the ocean again after that.
No. No, and they were pretty broken after that event.
Correct.
It is a strange fact of history, by the way. Japan was 2 days away from getting the bomb. I don't know if you knew that.
I didn't know this.
They actually had a nuclear test in North Korea. Well, it was Korea at the time, but the northern part of Korea, which they had occupied that area. And they had a nuclear test 2 days before Hiroshima, the dropping on Hiroshima. And Russia then invaded that peninsula, and they took all that info back to Russia with them. This is only discovered in the last 10 years, apparently. But that's how...
I think few people know this.
Yeah, that's how narrow the gap was between Japan, because Japan was striving for the bomb, and Germany was certainly striving for the bomb. And had they gained it, we would have had a very different kind of show going on. But the fact that all the superpowers were at the time striving to produce this splitting of the atom and the power that was released was sort of an effect, I think, of the thing that was begun back in the 1700s in the Enlightenment. And so what we call the end of the old world really began 200 years before. Mary Shelley, when she writes Frankenstein in 1814 or 15, basically is outlining what's going to happen in the next 100 years. That's why that novel is so significant. It's that we are going to see the human person as a machine, and that the human person will become a single cog in a whole machine of the world. And it will cause psychological fractioning, and it will cause violence, and it will cause abuse of women, and it will cause ultimately the last scene is sort of a Dante-esque condemnation to hell. So she was not very optimistic about where any of that was going.
We're seeing a lot of tinkering of people right now.
Yeah. That's an issue right there, isn't it?
Yeah.
But what the Enlightenment seems to have done is it said that humans are not made in the image and likeness of God. That's superstitious thought. We have to get rid of that in order to control the world and bend it to our desires. Francis Bacon was...
It just gets in the way if you think that.
It gets in the way, yeah. And so you see it as a machine, and you can fix everything. Which, on the one hand, there's a great deal of goodness in that. I mean, modern medicine, for instance, up to maybe recently, could be seen as something wonderful. And modern housing, modern lighting, modern money, the clothes that we wear, the fact that we can actually get food, all these are great things, and all products of the Enlightenment. But all of them are dependent upon the idea that there's a machine that needs to be fixed, or that can be manipulated or controlled. And when we begin thinking about human beings as machines, we lose purpose or point for keeping human beings around unless they are necessary for the bigger machine. And I think that commentary is playing itself out in our modern era right now. I think what we're seeing is the end result of what began 200 plus years ago, 300 years now, which was this desire to make the world under our control. A godlike desire, a Promethean desire. Mary Shelley says that Frankenstein, she has the subtitle Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. Meaning, Prometheus is the ancient world figure that steals fire from the gods and brings it to man, image of technology. And in Nolan's movie, that's the subtitle of Oppenheimer. Right? It's Oppenheimer, the modern Prometheus, And so he's doing the same thing. He's saying basically this dropping of the bomb, this atom thing, the splitting of the atom, this is the same thing that Mary Shelley was commenting on. And it's the idea that the human person has been reduced to one random element in a whole universe of random elements that can be manipulated or destroyed or used. It's a problem which I think is probably close to the root of why we have the other issues too, in my opinion. The violence, the barbarism, the lack of manliness, all these, I think, can be traced back to some degree to this idea that we're nothing but a meat bag on a bone stick. Once we subscribe to that idea, and to some degree we have to, just to be able to, go under the knife if we have to have surgery. We have to subscribe to some degree to it. Once we subscribe to it, we begin to fall into, I think, a very dangerous Tartarus.
Well, everything becomes permitted.
Yeah, right. As Dostoevsky says, yeah. Yeah, and Dostoevsky, that's interesting that you should comment on that. You've read the Brothers K, that's a Trinity thing, I think. Dostoevsky was writing back there in the mid to later part of the 19th century. Mm-hmm. And he was commenting on something he was seeing in Russia there in 1845 and 1850, which was an attempt to modernize Russia. Mm. And to do so, you had to strip God out of the picture. You had to get rid of the whole God phenomenon, the whole God fantasy. And Dostoevsky's saying, well...
Would it even be industrialized if they didn't?
No, they wouldn't. Yeah. They would still be stuck
or unified in any capacity.
They would still have serfs, probably.
Yeah.
You know, the whole releasing of serfs was in order to become more modern. But they also wouldn't have Raskolnikovs running around. And Raskolnikov is a perfect Nietzschean example of what goes wrong when it goes wrong. I'm going to test the limits, and the inner beast within me is going to be released on this landlady. I think that a modern era like ours, which lacks a sense of purpose or a sense of dignity in the human person, which actually puts down that sense of the old order. You know, they were wrong. They were barbarians back then. They were stupid. They were silly. Mm. We have it now. We have microwaves and you know, the pill. I think that breeds Grendels. It breeds monsters. Yeah, and a modern world, which I think breeds it, is one of the reasons why, like we talk about vocation in teaching.
Yeah.
This is, for me, this is the vocation, because I think that young men and women both are capable of becoming monsters, just as they're capable of becoming great saints. Mm-hmm. And if, for instance, if I or others don't step in to help them deal with that propensity, who's going to help them? You know, who's going to be able to train them to be able to deal with that?
Typically, parents are too busy to do it at an extremely high level.
Or, even worse, they were never trained themselves.
Sure.
And so they have no idea how to deal with it.
Reset the generational line of it.
Yeah. How far back do we send that, you know?
I don't know.
Because, I mean, you had a fairly good training yourself, but, I mean, imagine people growing up in the 90s even, generally didn't have a training in the tradition of holding themselves to humanity. And so how could they train their kids? And those kids grew up, and how could they train their kids? You know, and they grew up on a steady diet of violence and porn. And what do? You know, it's like, if you want to breed monsters, what is the Archer line? Do you want monsters? Because that's how you get monsters. You know, and that image of Grendel that I brought up, you know, from Beowulf, I think is a remarkable insight from way back 800 A.D. The Anglo-Saxons. Grendel's that troll that lives in the middle of nowhere in a swamp in his mom's basement. Like, what the fuck? That's what we're dealing with.
A lot of them.
You know?
Yeah.
A guy or gal that lives in their mom's basement and can't go anywhere, do anything, and just they breed. The mind is prone to great horrors, I think. And we end up conceiving tremendous horrors and dangers and fears that fester in us.
COVID didn't help because it encouraged people to kind of fester in that. Mm. And they said, oh, I can sort of keep surviving like this. And so before, they were kind of forced to, at the very least, kind of interact with others. And then there was this, it was a long period of time. A lot of people are ignoring how long it was, or they're just choosing to forget it, which is very unusual because they're seemingly trying to ramp it up again. I just don't think it's going to work this time. I think there's enough people that just felt so bamboozled.
Yeah.
And they're like, wow, it was really all for show. Yep. It was for show. Yep. None of this actually mattered. And the masking, I mean, I'll go to Costco. And every time I go now, over these last 2 months, it just seems like, well, it was 1 out of every 50 people. And now it's 1 out of every 40 people. Yeah. And then it became 1 out of every 30 people. And it just seems like, well, they admitted that it wasn't actually capable of assisting this.
No, it isn't.
So what is it again?
I think it's 2 things. Yeah. The mask, for instance, I think it's 2 things. One, it's a placebo. The disease, the virus, was ramped up and hyped as so lethal that we were going to see another bubonic plague.
That's how it was framed.
1/3 of our population was going to be decimated, was going to be destroyed.
Boy, did that not happen even
It didn't,
slightly.
thank God. But,
Yeah.
but the fear was so tremendous. And in the face of that fear, I think, humans latch on to anything that makes you think you have control. We don't like to not have control. It's one of, I think, most primal fears. Not having control over the world, our bodies, whatever, is terrifying. It's debilitating. I think that most people latched onto the mask primarily because they gave them a sense of control.
It was their blankie?
It was their blankie, yes. Second, and this is why I think it persisted so long and still persists in some people. I was just going through Dinkytown, and there's a guy standing on the corner with a mask, and it was down near his jowls.
Such an unusual thing to see.
Well, what was worse, he was jogging down the street with a mask on. I'm like, dude, you're jogging, you're in the street, your mask isn't even on your face. Why do you have the damn thing?
There's nobody around you.
But I think this is the second piece. Is that I think that it is a symbol of a clannishness, a clannish symbol. I still subscribe to this idea, and I'm part of this clan, a group thing, group identity. And then, of course, there's habit. There's just people that just the habit of it.
I was having kind of not quite a dinner, but there was a few of us. I hang out with a group of guys once a month, and we tend to go to the pub after we hang. And one of them, friend of mine, his name's Sam, was basically saying, well, we needed to protect Dick, who is an older gentleman.
Yeah.
And I asked him, I said, but Sam, it was proven that wouldn't have. And he's like, well, we didn't know that it couldn't have. And so what hurt was it to just try? I was like, well, I understand that, but if we take that same perspective, then they could just suggest anything will protect anything from anything. And you're just going to follow it blindly? I didn't say that, but it's what my heart was saying internally. And like the questioning, which I think is a very human characteristic, questioning in general is being taken away from us.
Well, yeah,
and the value in it. And I get it. Like when I was a kid, I questioned too much, right? So where's that balance? Where there's value in questioning everything around you and being very open about it, or questioning nothing and allowing the world to completely take control of you.
Yeah, because the lack of questioning leads to blind following.
And just scary.
Yeah.
I was terrified of what was becoming of America during COVID.
Yeah.
And not because of the disease. I had no fear of the disease. I was afraid of the response.
Yes.
I was afraid of how people were treating one another. I mean, I got called by someone in Nisswa demanding that I not go up north because I'm going to bring the disease up to Nisswa. And I laughed and I said, I just, if that's your perspective, I hate to tell you, nothing's going to keep me from going up there. But I'll note your statement. I'll put it in a book, and I'm just going to put it on the shelf because, it's not going to be me that ends the world as you know it up there in Nisswa.
Or even ends Nisswa.
Yeah. Gosh, it was so much.
Well, that is funny. It's funny. Again, it's perspective, isn't it? I mean, on the one hand, you get perspective historically because you realize there are a lot worse things that have happened and could happen.
Sure.
But then it's also perspective in terms of the gravity of the situation. This may sound really cruel, and it probably is cruel, but you could catch COVID and die. That's true.
Sure.
You could also get hit by a bus and die. You could also contract cancer and die. You could also choke on a peanut and die. We could get hit by an asteroid. Parts of the world could suffer a tsunami or an earthquake, or as we're seeing now in Canada, fire. You could anger your spouse and get stabbed. It's like, what is it? Are you saying you're never going to die? You don't want to die? Well, who does? I mean, nobody does.
So thumos in that is, well, these things may happen, but stay measured anyway.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a funny story that is in a children's storybook of all things, The Fool of the World. And he is going to get married to this girl, and her mother goes down to get beer from the cellar, and she won't come up for several minutes, and then they go find her, and the daughter goes find her. She's not there, comes up, and then the father, and he won't come up. And anyway, finally the guy goes to find them, and they're all sitting on the steps crying. And they're like, why are you crying? And the mother says, well, you all are going to get married, and then you're going to have a child, and the child's going to come down here to get beer, and the axe that's over the wall is going to fall on him and kill him, and he's going to die, and it's going to be sad. And he's like, you guys are idiots. I'm going to find people that are worse idiots than you before I marry you, because this is ridiculous.
That's funny.
Yeah, it's sort of like that. It's sort of like it's like a Chicken Little thing. When you run around thinking that everything's going to kill you, well, guess what? Something will.
Sure.
And thumatic response has to be, I know I'm going to die. I don't want to, but it doesn't mean I'm going to stop operating. Right?
But people did.
Yeah, I know.
Operating.
They completely shut down. It was that early days before masks, and I don't know if most people remember this, but remember, before masks, people were like putting Saran Wrap over their face and bee netting, and I saw one guy with 2 milk jugs that he'd tied together to protect him from the disease. It's like, dude, that's not how viruses work.
I was in an airport, and I saw an entire family practically have what are these suits called that, if you're going into a, I don't know, like nuclear.
Oh, like a hazmat.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
It was a mom and a dad and 2 kids, and it was really, at some point I was
like
like,
Chernobyl.
I couldn't help but saying, I was like, that's the best crisis actor family I have ever seen. What are they paying you? I yelled at the family. What are you getting paid to walk like this through this airport? Are you doing this just to scare us all? I couldn't help but saying it. If they weren't being paid for that, I was just terrified of what it's like in their household.
What it's like in their head. I mean, you're right, Geoffrey. In this case, in those early days especially, there was so much fear. People were so
a lot of people buying guns.
Yeah. And this is how you sow chaos. This is how you sow destruction of society. And it was a long time coming. I will say this: we think that this was a unique phenomenon that just happened overnight. I am of the opinion that it was a long time planning and coming. Mm-hmm. Now, the opposite of the person who doesn't question is a person who questions too much, and they can fall into paranoia.
I fall into that sometimes.
You could fall into paranoia, and
I'm proud of my paranoia because it helped me.
Well, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean people aren't following you, right?
Yeah.
But I do tend to think that there has been a long-term attempt to do what has been done in the last 3 years. Mm-hmm. And by long-term, I mean somewhere around the 1880s. Okay. And I don't mean this one guy up there being like, it's like a Darth Vader or something like that. I think that it is a mindset, as George Carlin, the comedian, said, that these people that think this way went to the same schools, they read the same literature, they operated in the same circles, and they worked together because they also
hire each other.
They hire each other. They intermarry.
100%.
So in some ways, I think that conspiracy is. The conspiracy is real. It is real in the sense that I think that there are some people that think they're making the world better by doing what they're doing, and what they're doing is it was called progressivism back during the 1920s and 1910s. Before that, it was called utopianism. The idea they were bringing about a utopian world. And I honestly didn't know this until this summer.
The management of children.
Yes.
But everybody's a child.
Everybody's a child.
And they don't know better for themselves.
Right.
They must be babysat. Because if they don't, if they're not, then they'll just degrade each other.
Well, you're absolutely right.
But the babysitting of everybody ended up turning everybody into children, which is so strange.
It made infants out of adults. But I think it's worse than that, as Jordan Peterson says. It's worse than that, as he says, because I think that it is, it's actually thinking of human beings as units of power. And this was pointed out by a philosopher whose name suddenly eludes me. His work is called The Machine in the Garden, and he he talks about how modernity looks at human beings and everything else in the world, not as creation, but as units of power to be stored up and then employed when you need to employ it. And I didn't know.
It's a very capitalist way of seeing it.
Very, very capitalist way of seeing it. Yes, absolutely. And capitalism run amok is a very dangerous thing. But I did not know until this summer that traces its roots back to the 1880s. I had thought that Woodrow Wilson and those other sons of bitches were the guys that really
Tell us how you really feel about Wilson.
Yeah, well, I have no mercy on certain historical figures because they just appall me. I mean, Margaret Sanger. I have no mercy on that woman.
Yeah.
She's an appalling figure.
Yeah.
In some ways worse.
Treating people as weeds.
Yeah, and treating ethnic minorities as weeds. That somehow because you have a different pigment in your skin, you are a lesser being.
Yeah, that's crazy.
It's insane. It's insane that was taken as science. Follow the science. Well, the science says that if you have a sloping brow and large lips, you must be a primate. That's just disgusting to me. But it is like, that's the science. Follow the science. Woodrow Wilson followed the science. He was a deep racist. He was a guy who was a fan of the Ku Klux Klan. And he was not alone in this. But what I didn't know was that he was 40 years late to the game. 1880s is what we're talking here. And this was people that were primarily in America, but also in Europe, were already writing about a utopianism in the future, and they said it in 2000, oddly enough, where humans would be reduced in population to a manageable size, where the government and the business were one and the same, and where every physical need would be given to people by the government. And it was going to be a beautiful, glorious future. And people that had genetic problems or diseases would no longer, they'd be gone. They wouldn't be there anymore. And ethnic minorities wouldn't be there anymore because that's all problematic. You got to get rid of that. This guy that wrote this book called Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy, he and his cousin, I think, were the progenitors of the eugenics movement that then dominated in the early part of the 20th century. And Margaret Sanger is a product of that. And he wrote this, it's a terrible book. It's not terrible as in it had bad ideas. It's badly written. It's like people walk around and talk, and then they do some more walking and they talk. And maybe they eat something and then they talk. It's kind of like the Attack of the Clones in a novel form. It's boring, but the ideas espoused in it are terrifying. Because these ideas were all this utopian stuff going on, and the government's going to give us everything we need, and people will be happy and everything they want. And he foresaw things like the cell phone in 1887 or whatever it was. He saw the cell phone. He saw the radio. He foresaw the delivery to your door from a warehouse.
Wow.
It's amazing how prescient he is. But at the same time, he also foresaw a future where how do you get from to there is the question, because he leaves that completely out. He hints at it, that science will help us to diminish the population. How? Well, it leaves it Margaret Sanger. Leave it to Margaret Sanger to develop that idea.
Take the torch is what she did.
Yes,
essentially.
She did. And one of the reasons we know that is that his ideas were so popular that societies sprung up around America and in Europe, specifically in Germany, called Bellamy societies. And people would get together at a pub, and talk about the ideas that Bellamy was proposing. How do we enact those ideas? How do we
implement this?
How do we implement it?
Yeah.
One of the people, a member of the Bellamy Society, was Margaret Sanger. Now, strangely enough, another member of that society was Goebbels.
Really?
Yes. Now they
and
chew on that for a minute,
is it conspiratorial? Not really, because these people existed.
I know.
They wrote about it.
I know.
They said it very publicly. Others listened.
Yep. And men like Goebbels and Hitler and the others who were members of the Bellamy societies, but also members of Madame Blavatsky's spiritualism,
That's a name I've not heard.
Madame Blavatsky was a spiritualist, which was a big deal in 1910, roughly 1910 to 1940, where she was saying that there's a much older religion, and it has to do with the spirit, the human spirit.
Is it the Vril Society or teetering on the occult of some
Yeah, it's
sort?
a cult. It's occultism, really.
Yeah.
It's occultism. And it was a replacement for Christianity, basically. Christianity was, in her opinion, a thin knockoff of the real religion, which was occultism. And she had seances, and struggle sessions, I guess you'd call too, where people would expose their inner pain and sorrow.
I've seen this.
Yeah?
I've been to places where people have, and I'm just looking around. I'm like,
Just like freaky.
how
isn't
did I
it?
get invited to this show, to this party, to these people?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what's really startling too to me,
It exists.
it exists.
Yeah.
And
This is
it's
not
on
fake.
it's on the rise to some
Yes.
degree.
Yeah.
In the absence of Christianity, we see a rise in power. We see a rise in utopianism. We see a rise in spirituality, occultism. There was that movie made, what was it, in the 1990s, called Eyes Wide Shut.
Phenomenal.
When was that? Was it 90s? Kubrick, yeah. It was, and it was an amazing movie. Amazing
98
movie.
maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what he was trying to show
2000.
was that occult thing going on in Hollywood that led to the whole Weinstein blow up later on. But it's not
not
limited.
fake.
It's not fake, and it's
No.
not limited
And it's
to
not
Hollywood.
It's not stopped.
No, in fact, I don't know. I kind of think it's gotten worse because it's
Or this Croatian artist that does the, what does she call it? Soul dinners or something like that.
What is
Abramovich or something.
oh, I've heard this name.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell me more about that. What is that all about?
She was an artist that, gosh, who was the? I'm losing it. I think someone out of New York has a lot of her art around his home. I can't. The names aren't. I'm having difficulty recalling the names, but first they do it because it's fun and they just like to be around the same kinds of people, and then some of them begin to just believe in it. That's the next.
Sure.
That's how it evolves.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the way it always does, because what you do is what you eventually become, It's the Aristotelian thing. And what we oftentimes forget in our modern world, and maybe after the last 3 years we won't forget it as easily, is that rich and powerful people can also be part of those utopian occult movements. They aren't going to come out and say, hey, everybody, I'm an occultist.
Sure.
But they are. And then their money goes into implementing that on a larger scale.
But aren't there men of extreme power that are unwilling to participate in these
I think
things?
absolutely.
But they're just not willing to publicly deny it?
Well, this is the thing that
It seems like the only person that's trying to publicly deny it, and I know Musk isn't a Christian, but he seems like he's kind of out there purposely and intentionally saying, oh, this is nonsense.
I think so. He's taking it to the enemy, so to speak. I mean, even his
I mean, we're kind of lucky that he exists.
I think
keep
so.
saying that to some of my friends.
I think so. I think so. I mean, like him or not like him, I think that he's a force for good right now.
It seems that way.
Even that thing, that cage match with Facebook guy. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah.
I'm going to take him in the Coliseum. I thought that was hysterical.
Yeah. Are they still doing that?
I have no idea. I don't
chosen
know.
not
If they
to.
do, I think it'd be fun to watch. But yeah, well, he's actually a martial artist. Well, I'm a mixed martial artist. Whatever. But anyway, I think there are men and women who are powerful and well spoken and have a voice that they do stand in the gap against what is pretty obviously evil. Call it whatever you want to call it. It's essentially evil.
Sure.
But I've come to have to reckon in the last 10 years with the politics of human interaction. I didn't used to reckon with this at all, Geoffrey. And back in the day, I was like, screw it, I'll do whatever I want and suffer the consequences. And I've come to realize that there is a very dangerous, powerful game going on in the world right now. And the people that are in power or have power are very aware of how it's played. So if they're good men or good women, they have to be very careful. I think about what happened.
Because they'd lose it all?
Yeah. I mean, I think about somebody like Jordan Peterson. I admire that man very much. I really do.
Just he's being court ordered to go into
But he's being court ordered to go into...
re-education camp.
It's essentially re-education camp.
We've never seen anything like this.
This is like a
before.
North Korea thing almost. It's like,
Yeah.
wow, that's amazing.
He's literally going to be pulled into a separate space for a long period of time and be conditioned into how you're supposed to manage yourself publicly. It's fucking crazy.
He will vote over and over again until he gets it right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's insane. It really is insane. And he went through already this terrible experience of the being doxxed and the health issues and all that. And that was horrible. And he recovered from it. And he came back, roaring back. And I love his most recent stuff. But I think he's very aware that this is a very dangerous game that we're all playing right now.
You and I are right now.
Yep.
Because this is going to be public.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. And I'm aware of this. I'm aware of this. And that's why I don't play outside. Remember, Robert Frost, good walls make good neighbors.
Sure.
I try not to play outside of my sphere. I try not to, say, for instance, pretend like I'm a psychologist or pretend that I have a political voice when I don't. But expressing opinions by anybody is dangerous right now. But it's necessary. It's necessary.
See, what I thought was interesting is, back to COVID, it was the being able to express your opinions with people, but with them, in their presence, that those persons tended to deal with the difficulties of what was happening the most. I think this is one of the reasons why I wasn't scared, because I had friends that I would see often. I didn't play this game of hiding and staying 3 feet apart or any of these sorts of things. I very intentionally was around people and we discussed it.
Yeah.
And because we discussed it, all of us were optimistic. All of us were and I think the divide and conquer thing was very real.
Yep.
If we keep them apart, they are all going to think that they're about to die.
Yeah. Fear festers in solitude.
Which is why I really was intentional and tried to reach out to other people that I didn't know well and spend time with them.
Well, I think you're absolutely right on that score. There's a phrase, one man sharpens another. And I think I really subscribe to that. And I remember back when that shutdown first occurred, and there were several days of just like this confusion and I will say fear. I was afraid. But afraid of not the disease so much as the turbulence and the violence and then it was that summer that we had the burning of Minneapolis, so it wasn't like very soon afterwards. Oh yeah, lockdown. Well, yeah, we could burn the city down though, but that's okay. And so you had all these other elements that were like, what the, So there was an element of fear and isolation and turbulence and confusion. But I remember I joined this very good group out of my own parish, a Shakespeare group. My good friend.
Where's your parish?
Holy Family Catholic Church
in St. Louis Park.
St. Louis Park, yeah. Very good pastor there, Father Joseph. But one of my very good friends, Mark Johnson, invited me to this group.
I know Mark.
You do, yes. Yeah, his kids, I think, went to Trinity. Yeah, right. And he invited me to this group, and at first I was very hesitant because my experience of groups has been pass the Beanie Baby and share your emotions. I'm like, fuck that, I'm not going to pass the Beanie Baby or share my emotions. And book clubs had always been a disaster because, we get on the Oprah Winfrey list or whatever it is, and we read her latest thing. But this was different. This was reading out loud very good work, Shakespeare plays, and then discussing those with other men. And I joined eventually, and skeptical at first, but over time I realized this was exactly what I needed. I believe in providence. The divine providence. And I think this was providential because had I not had this, I think I would have been in a much worse state. It was that group that I joined roughly in the time of right after the burning that I was able to connect with other guys and talk with other guys and talk about issues other than Shakespeare and use Shakespeare as a sort of shield to be able to look at the Gorgon that I was going through. The myth of the Gorgon, right, where Theseus has the shield and the sword, and he looks at the shield instead of the Gorgon so he doesn't get turned to stone. And I've always held that's art. The shield is art. You talk about the shield rather than the thing that you're going through. This is really ubiquitous with men especially. I think men do this all the time because we have a hard time we could talk about ideas. When we talk about emotions, it's very difficult, I think, for most guys. And so what we do is we talk about an art piece or a sporting match or some other thing. And through that, we end up expressing the fact that, God, I'm just not in a good place right now or whatever.
Again, there's going to be a lot of people, I hope, that take a few minutes out of their lives and listen to this, because I think it will reinforce their own belief.
Yes.
And they have it. And more people do than we believe that they do, or that they believe that they do. And the more of these conversations that exist, the more they can become more public with their own thoughts.
Yes.
Yeah.
And along those lines, I would say, hope is something which is lacking in our modern world.
For sure.
And we
Actual
gain
hope.
gain hope by talking with other individuals.
Yeah.
And that way we're able to not decrease, but increase even in a moment of crisis. There's that great line out of the Battle of Malden, the Anglo-Saxon poem, where he says something to the effect of, mind shall be keener, heart the stronger, mood the merrier, as our strength lessens. And I love that image, even though we know that we're on the decline, even though we know we're up against this tremendous enemy, we can't lose hope. Our mood has to increase, our strength lessens, but our camaraderie and joy increases. It's very important not to give up hope, and along those lines, I really appreciate this.